Community leaders in Boston are pushing for a stronger response to recent fatal shootings, including one early this morning in Dorchester. The level of gun violence hardly compares with the numbers in the early 1990s, but the numbers are much worse than what Boston achieved in the late 90s, thanks to prevention efforts known as the Boston Miracle. To tell us about new efforts to mobilize the community is the founder of Violence in Boston, Inc., Monica Cannon-Grant. Thank you very much for being with us, Monica.
Thank you for having me.
If you look at the map, a lot of these gun violence acts, they take place in the same parts of the city over and over again. In the news, we see a spike. What do you see?
I see consistency for people, specifically in communities of color. We've watched these things happen on a consistent basis since, I want to say last year, wintertime in December. There was a large increase in the wintertime, and we talked about a spike at that time. Then we had a very deadly 4th of July. And it's been consistent. I think that mainly the reason why people are paying attention is because these last few, there's been 6 in 6 days.
And the thing to keep in mind about violence, even if it happens late at night, the people who suffer, they're not necessarily people, on the fringe, living dangerously. I mean, this could be anybody.
Right. And so, when we look at the violence that is plaguing communities of color, that's a symptom. The root cause is poverty. When you look at the communities that these acts are happening in, it's predominantly people of color who live below the poverty level. Roxbury in itself is 33% below poverty level. The median income is $28,000 to $30,000 a year. And so when you have communities like these that are constantly receiving cuts, these are the repercussions.
I think of the map where I see the gunshots, I see high levels of poverty and also high levels of incarceration. What's going on?
Well, we don't do a really good job with our reentry services and with preventing recidivism. I think that oftentimes people come home from prison and we tell them to get their lives together, but we have very few programs and opportunities for them to do just that. Something as simple as getting your license and your birth certificate and your social security card when they've come home from serving terms is difficult for them with no income. They can't live in federal housing because they have a quarry, and so there are a number of different factors that prevent them from actually being successful.
If you go back to the 90s, what was going on that made that so effective? I mean they reduced the gun violence by something like more than 60%. What happened?
So, as a kid born in the 80s, one thing I will say is there was a lot of community involvement. In fact, it was community driven. What we see now is constant funding being dumped into the police department. But in the 90s, we had community leaders leading the police and elected officials in the communities, letting them know which families needed help, which families were the most at risk, and actually providing direct service. And I think that plays a major role. We can't keep treating the symptoms. So we help the young person, but we don't look at the household that the young person comes from.
What kind of services do you think would help?
So I think social services, when we talk employment, oftentimes, we hear different programs like Operation Exit for specifically individuals who have been criminally involved. But you have a group of young people that may not want to go into the trades. They may not want to work with their hands. We need other options. Some children are artistic. Some might want to draw. Some might want to sing. When we talk about the household, it's providing real employment opportunities. Right now, we've seen multiple media outlets highlight the fact that most people who live here can't afford to be here. And so you have households where either one parent is working, both parents are working, multiple jobs, and children are latchkey children. They're letting themselves in after school. They're taking care of other siblings. And we're in an age of social media, and I think all those things play a major part.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Monica Cannon-Grant from Violence in Boston, Inc. Monica, if you go back to the 80s, people associated violence with drug trade, especially crack at the time. Mm-hmm. Today, we're talking more about fentanyl. Mm-hmm. Does that play into this in some way?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people, specifically Black people in the Black community, are frustrated because when it was crack in the 80s, we were criminalized. And oftentimes, people who needed treatment didn't get treatment and were incarcerated. Now that we're having a conversation about fentanyl and opiates and the different drugs that are affecting our community, the face of those drugs have changed, and we're creating treatment programs and we're creating resources. and the failure on behalf of not just the city of Boston, but the state of Massachusetts as a whole to actually treat victims from the crack epidemic is a lot of the reasons why we see the things happening that we're seeing now.
Well, part of this is also to get people from the community mobilized. First, you have an event that you're planning tonight. What are you going to do exactly?
So we're doing a standout in Roxbury on the stairs of the Bruce Bowling Building at 6 p.m. this evening, and we're going to be making demands to the mayor and elected officials. We've watched them on multiple occasions show up for other communities, and we need that same urgency for Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan. When there was a murder in South Boston came together, put together a meeting, but it was a listening session. Elected officials weren't allowed to speak, and the community voiced what they wanted to have done. We want that same level of concern from our elected officials.
Well, I remember the coverage in South Boston, and of course I think this was maybe about the fatal car crash, and you know, meetings were packed, people were pushing something. Can you make that happen here?
I'm going to try, Chris. I mean, I've organized 45,000 people against racism in this city, so I've reached out to every ally I could possibly reach out to. And also, you know, one of the things that's most difficult is trying to empower people that have been broken. We're dealing with communities that have been suffering from trauma and lack of resources for a really long time, and trying to encourage them that change is coming is one of the most difficult things when they've watched time and time again their concerns be brushed to the side. So,
what about those trauma teams the city has been using? Are they working, you think?
So in my opinion, they've done a lot of valuable work, but they can do better. I don't think that you should only show up when you're called. When someone is shot or stabbed, we know that trauma is inevitable. When one person is shot or stabbed, up to 20 people are affected. And so I think that they should automatically show up in communities of color. I think that they shouldn't just show up on a temporary basis, but provide actual resources. Because then you have individuals like myself who get multiple phone calls and messages and emails from family members seeking help because they've received a disservice.
We should mention people want to keep up with the campaign. You've got a social media page they can go to?
Absolutely. So they can follow Violence in Boston. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And on Twitter, it's Violence, the letter N, and Boston. We post the crime, we track it. We post data, we post upcoming events. We do standouts, we do rallies of accountability, but we also give back because, traumatized people need to experience joy as well. And so we try to do a little bit of both.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Monica Cannon Grant from Violence in Boston.